There is a file inside the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg that most researchers walk past without opening. It is not labeled as a weapons report. It is not stamped with the usual military classification codes. It is filed under a logistics review heading from the winter of 1942, buried between requisition forms for boot leather and field ration adjustments. But inside that file are withdrawal orders, quiet, administratively worded, almost bureaucratic in tone, for a category of close-quarters weapons that the Wehrmacht had quietly issued to its infantry units, and then, just as quietly, decided it wanted back. Not because the Allies demanded it, not because any international tribunal was watching, because German field commanders wrote back to OKW Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and said, in language that becomes more alarmed with each successive report, that something was going wrong with the men who carried these things. This is not a story about weapons that were banned by the Geneva Convention. Most of those stories have been told. This is a story about weapons that were banned from the inside by the army that issued them. And the 10 items we are covering today represent the full spectrum of that problem, from blades that were recalled after after-action reports described their use in terms that even hardened officers found difficult to process, to improvised impact weapons that frontline pioneer built in the field and carried in direct violation of standing orders. The Wehrmacht in the popular imagination is a monolithic, mechanized, coldly efficient force. The reality on the ground in the tunnels beneath Stalingrad, in the Bocage fighting in Normandy, in the bunker-clearing operations along the Siegfried Line was that close-quarters combat produced a completely different kind of soldier psychology. And High Command knew it and feared it. Look, the weapons on this list were not forbidden because they were too dangerous to the enemy. They were forbidden because of what they were doing to the men using them. Number 1. The Nahkampfmesser, field variant, specifically the unregulated versions that began appearing in significant numbers on the Eastern Front from 1941 onward. The Wehrmacht had an official close-quarters knife program, the Heer-issue gravity knife, the Fallschirmjäger Messer for paratroopers, the standard-issue bayonet. These were sanctioned, manufactured to specification, and distributed through proper logistics channels. What began appearing alongside them, and eventually instead of them in certain units, was something different. Soldiers, particularly in infantry divisions, that had been fighting continuous contact operations for months without rotation, began acquiring, trading, and fabricating knives with blade profiles that had no utility function, no wire-cutting notch, no can-opening spine modification, blades that were designed exclusively for one application, with a blade geometry, a deep, fuller groove running the full length, a reinforced point profile that military engineers recognized immediately as optimized for deep tissue penetration against a living target. The Sturmmesser, the general term used in some internal correspondence for these unregulated assault blades, was not a single model, it was a category. And by the winter of 1941-42, field reports from the Eastern Front were describing their use in bunker-clearing operations in terms that triggered the first formal internal review. The withdrawal order that followed did not describe these knives as illegal under international law. The language used was nicht förderlich zur Aufrechterhaltung der Kampfdisziplin, not conducive to the maintenance of combat discipline. That phrase appears in 3 separate directives between December 1941 and March 1942. The Army was not worried about war crimes, tribunals. It was worried about what its own men were becoming in close quarters. Number 2. The Grabendolch, the trench dagger, in its First World War carryover variants. Germany entered the Second World War with an institutional memory of the First. Officers who had served in the trenches of Verdun and the Somme were now commanding divisions, and many of them carried a specific cultural revulsion toward the weapons of that earlier war. The Grabendolch, the trench dagger that had been produced in enormous quantities between 1914 and 1918, with its double-edged blade, its knuckle-duster grip cast from brass or pressed steel, its overall design philosophy oriented entirely around killing a man in a confined space in the dark, had been formally retired from the German order of battle in the interwar period. It came back. Not through official channels. It came back through attics, through family trunks, through the simple fact that a soldier going into a fortified position at night will carry whatever he believes will keep him alive, regardless of what the supply manifest says. By 1942, Wehrmacht quartermaster reports from multiple fronts were documenting the presence of First World War-era Grabendolche in active frontline use. Some units had effectively rebuilt a parallel, informal armory of these weapons through barter and inheritance. A formal directive in April of 1942 ordered unit commanders to identify and confiscate any pre-1919 close-quarters blades being carried by their men. Compliance was inconsistent. The most honest field report from that period, from a Hauptmann commanding a rifle company in the Kharkov sector, simply noted that his men had been issued the order, acknowledged the order, and continued carrying what they had been carrying. He recommended the directive be reconsidered in light of operational realities. He was not disciplined. The directive was quietly not reissued. Number 3. The improvised Totschläger, the deadfall club manufactured from entrenching tool handles, sections of steel pipe, and in some documented cases, modified signal cable wrapped around a weighted core. The Wehrmacht issued the Kleines Schanzog, the short entrenching tool to its infantry, as a standard piece of kit. Every soldier carried one. What soldiers in extended contact operations discovered, as armies have discovered in every close-quarters war since antiquity, is that an entrenching tool is already a weapon. The short-handled, folding version the Wehrmacht used could be sharpened on the blade edge, and in that configuration it was used extensively, and there is nothing prohibited about that. It remained an officially sanctioned tool. The problem was, what happened next? Soldiers began fabricating standalone impact weapons weighted clubs, essentially from the handle sections of broken entrenching tools, from lengths of steel pipe salvaged from destroyed buildings, from signal cable weighted with stones, pieces of iron, sections of bolt. These were not improvised in a casual sense. Some of the recovered examples show considerable craftsmanship: leather wrapping for grip, lead weights poured into the hollow ends of pipe sections, cord lashing that took significant time to apply correctly. Men were investing effort into building these things. The Totschläger, the name simply means dead strike, was specifically prohibited by a Wehrmacht internal order in November of 1942 on the grounds that its use represented a reversion to pre-technological combat methods incompatible with the standards of the German soldier. That language is remarkable when you sit with it. The army that was issuing flamethrowers and using poison gas stockpiles as deterrent threats was concerned about its men carrying weighted clubs because of standards. The actual operational reason, stated more honestly in a separate medical corps report from the same period, was that the injuries produced by these weapons in close-quarters engagements were producing significant psychological trauma in the men using them, not just the men receiving them. Post-engagement psychiatric evaluations from units with high reported Totschläger use showed elevated rates of what would now be recognized as acute stress response. The Army's own doctors were documenting it. Number 4. The Springmesser, the German switchblade, in modified combat configurations. The Springmesser, the gravity-release folding knife, was a legally manufactured and commercially available item in pre-war Germany. It was not a military-issue weapon. What made it appear on prohibition lists was the pattern of modification that began showing up in confiscated examples from the Eastern Front from 1942 onward. Blade lengths extended beyond the standard commercial profile. Locking mechanisms reinforced to prevent blade foldback under lateral pressure, which is what happens when a folding blade is used for anything other than cutting rope or food. Some examples had the springs replaced with heavier gauge wire that produced a faster, louder deployment snap. These were not commercial knives being carried as utility tools. They were commercial knife frames being rebuilt into fighting knives while retaining the visual appearance of an innocent personal item. The prohibition on these modified variants was partly practical. A blade that locks open under pressure is a different weapon than one that does not, and partly about the same discipline concern that ran through every entry on this list. An officer who could not tell at a glance whether the knife in his soldier's pocket was a working tool or a dedicated fighting blade had lost a degree of control over his unit's armament. and Wehrmachtkommand was deeply, almost obsessively concerned with that control. Number 5. The Panzerfaust converted incendiary improvisation, field-modified to function as a close-quarters thermal weapon. Now, this one requires some context. The Panzerfaust, the single-shot disposable anti-tank weapon that became ubiquitous in German infantry units from 1943 onward, was one of the war's most straightforward designs: a steel tube, a propellant charge, an oversized hollow-charge warhead that defeated armor through shaped charge penetration. Simple, cheap, effective at its intended range of roughly 30 meters against armored targets. The modification that began appearing and that produced a specific internal prohibition in a Heer engineering directive from late 1943 involved removing the anti-tank warhead and replacing it through field improvisation with an incendiary payload, petrol-soaked material, phosphorus compounds salvaged from other munitions. In at least 2 documented cases, improvised napalm-adjacent mixtures using engine oil and gasoline thickened with soap or rubber shavings. The result was a single-shot, short-range incendiary projector that could clear a bunker or a room with burning material rather than a shaped charge. The prohibition was not about the incendiary effect per se. The Wehrmacht used flamethrowers extensively and had no formal objection to burning enemy personnel. The prohibition was about the safety profile of the modification. A Panzerfaust warhead is designed around a specific pressure-time curve. Replace that warhead with a container of flammable liquid and an improvised ignition source, and you have a device with an unpredictable ignition delay, a backblast profile that has not been engineered to protect the operator, and a failure mode specifically, a low-order detonation that ruptures the tube rather than fires the projectile that directed burning material backward toward the soldier holding it. Several self-inflicted burn casualties were documented before the directive was issued. The directive described the modification as extremely hazardous to the operating soldier and of uncertain tactical value. If you were a combat engineer reading that field report, knowing exactly what a low-order failure on a Panzerfaust improvisation would do to the man behind it, would you have continued carrying one? Because records show that at least some soldiers did. Tell me in the comments, because the engineering analysis on this specific modification is something military historians still find genuinely difficult to reconstruct. Number 6. The Erdkampfmesser, the earth-fighting knife, a term that appears in only a handful of internal documents and refers to a specific subcategory of blade designed for fighting in confined underground positions. The tunnel and bunker warfare on the Eastern Front, particularly in the urban combat environments of Stalingrad, and later in the fortified line fighting along the Dnieper, produced a specific demand, a weapon that could be used in a space so confined that a standard bayonet could not be effectively deployed, where a man could not extend his arm to full reach. The Erdkampfmesser that began appearing in confiscated weapon inventories from these sectors was typically short blade lengths between 4 and 6 inches, but with a handle geometry specifically designed to maintain grip when the hand was braced against a wall or surface. Some examples had a reversed curve on the trailing edge of the blade, a design feature that serves no cutting utility and exists purely to maintain penetration angle when the operator's movement is mechanically constrained. These were purpose-built for killing men in holes in the ground. Nothing else. The internal prohibition on these weapons, issued through a Pioneer Engineering Command circular in early 1943, used strikingly direct language for a military bureaucratic document. Weapons of this type serve no function consistent with the maintenance of unit cohesion and are to be surrendered immediately upon identification. The phrase maintenance of unit cohesion appears to have been the standard euphemism in Wehrmacht internal correspondence for the concern that men who trained and equipped themselves for this kind of killing were developing psychological profiles that made them difficult to command. Effective in their specific environment, yes, but difficult. Number 7. The modified Stahlroot, the steel rod carried as an impact weapon by certain pioneer and assault engineering units. The Stahlroot in its standard form was a tool, a steel rod, typically around 18 inches in length, used in demolitions work to probe soil for buried obstacles, to test concrete for hollow spaces, to manipulate fused charges at a distance. Every combat engineer unit had them. They were unremarkable. What was remarkable was the pattern of modification that began showing up in recovered examples, from assault engineering units operating in the fortified defensive lines of the Siegfried Line campaign and in the bunker complexes of the Paich Atlantic Wall construction zones. Modified Stahlruten were being found with one end wrapped in leather or rubber for grip, with the opposite end machined or filed to a weighted profile, sometimes with a drilled cavity that had been filled with poured lead. The weight differential between the two ends of these modified rods transformed them from probing tools into purpose-built impact weapons, functionally identical to a police-patterned sap or weighted baton. The balance point had been deliberately shifted. That does not happen by accident. The prohibition on these came through an engineering corps directive that noted the modifications were inconsistent with the tool's designated purpose and ordered that any Stahlroot found to have been structurally altered was to be confiscated and the modifying soldier identified and disciplined. Enforcement records suggest the discipline was rarely applied with any severity. The weapons kept appearing. Number 8. The Drahtschier Klinge, the wire cutter blade hybrid. A field improvisation that combined the frame of a standard wire-cutting tool with a sharpened blade element along the cutting jaw, effectively creating a weapon that could function simultaneously as a breaching tool and a close-quarters slashing instrument. Wire cutting was a core skill for any soldier operating against defended positions. The Wehrmacht issued purpose-built wire cutters to its engineer and assault units. In the close-quarters work of breaching barbed wire barriers at night, often under fire, those wire cutters were already in the soldier's hand when contact was made. The improvisation was almost inevitable in retrospect. Sharpen the inner jaw of the cutter frame, extend the cutting edge along the jaw profile, and the tool you were already holding in a wire breach scenario could also be used as a weapon in the seconds immediately after breach, before you had time to transition to your primary arm. The resulting hybrid wire cutter in the outer jaw, sharpened blade along the inner, was found in sufficient numbers by unit inspectors in 1943 that a specific identification protocol was issued to help inspectors distinguish modified wire cutters from standard-issue ones during kit inspections. The prohibition was framed as a safety concern. A sharpened jaw on a wire cutter creates an unintended laceration risk to the operator during normal breaching operations. That framing was technically accurate. It was also almost certainly not the primary reason for the prohibition. Number 9. The Knuppelmine, the improvised, pressure-detonated personal weapon, a device so crude and so dangerous to its own user that the after-action reports describing it read almost like dark comedy, if the context were not what it is. In the late-war defensive fighting on the Eastern Front, as German infantry units were increasingly placed in static defensive positions without the manpower to maintain continuous observation of their entire perimeter, soldiers began constructing improvised personal defense devices from salvaged materials. The Knuppelmine, the name, is informal and appears in only a few unit reports, likely a dark humor designation applied by the soldiers themselves, was a simple, impact-detonated, improvised explosive assembled from components that any infantryman had immediate access to. A wooden club or heavy stick as the body, with a detonator cap from a standard stick grenade fitted into the weighted end, the assembly arranged so that a hard blow against a target would compress the detonator and detonate a small explosive charge attached to the striking end. The engineering concept, such as it was, required the detonator to be shock-sensitive enough to fire on impact with the target, but not so sensitive that it fired on incidental contact during carry or movement. This is an extraordinarily difficult balance to achieve with improvised materials and no engineering support, and the documentation suggests that a significant number of these devices did not achieve it. Several soldiers were recorded as having detonated their own devices during movement. The prohibition, issued through a Field Army directive in 1944, described these devices as presenting unacceptable risk of self-inflicted casualties and ordered their immediate destruction upon discovery. The fact that a formal prohibition was considered necessary suggests that they were appearing in sufficient numbers that simply telling individual soldiers not to build them was not working. Number 10. The Sturmpistole misuse category, specifically the use of the standard Wehrmacht signal pistol, the LP Leuchtepistole, loaded with improvised anti-personnel charges at contact range. The Leuchtpistole, the flare pistol, was standard issue equipment. Every infantry unit had them for signal purposes, calling artillery, marking positions, signaling adjacent units. They fired 27mm signal flares. They were not designed as weapons. The ammunition was not designed to produce lethal fragmentation. None of this stopped soldiers from loading them with improvised charges and using them at point-blank range in close-quarters engagements. The Wehrmacht eventually acknowledged this reality and actually developed a legitimate anti-personnel variant, the Sturmpistole attachment, a rifled steel insert that allowed the signal pistol to fire a small grenade round. That development was an official response to the fact that soldiers were already doing something with these weapons in the field. But alongside the official Sturmpistole variant, the improvised loading of standard flare pistols with improvised charges, broken glass, scrap metal, improvised propellant combinations continued, and it continued in a form that the Army could not sanction because the improvised charges produced unpredictable chamber pressures in a weapon not designed to handle them. Several barrel ruptures were documented. Several soldiers lost hands. The prohibition on improvised loading of the Leuchtpistole was issued and reissued multiple times across different commands, which is usually a reliable indicator that it was not being followed. Look, there is a pattern running through every one of these 10 items that is worth stating directly without editorializing about it. Every single prohibition on this list was issued not by an international body, not by a neutral arbitration authority, not by the opposing forces, but by the German military itself. And in nearly every case, the stated reason safety, discipline, unit cohesion translates into a single underlying reality. The Wehrmacht's command structure had issued these men into conditions that produced a specific psychological and behavioral adaptation, and then discovered that some of the adaptations were ones they could not control. A soldier who has spent 3 months in continuous close-quarters contact on the Eastern Front, who has built or acquired a specialized killing tool and integrated it into his daily survival calculus, does not surrender that tool because a directive tells him to. The directives knew this. The casualty reports knew this. The medical corps evaluations knew this. The weapons on this list were not the anomaly. They were the evidence. Evidence of what the conditions of that war actually produced in the men who survived long enough to adapt to them. There is a supplementary file attached to that Bundesarchiv logistics review, the one filed under boot leather and field ration adjustments. It contains a list of names. Soldiers identified in unit inspection reports as having been found in possession of prohibited close-quarters weapons during the 1942 to 1944 period. There are 437 names on that list. The disciplinary outcomes column next to most of those names is blank. The Army asked for the weapons back. Most of the men kept them. The next entry in that file is a weapons category that never appeared on any official prohibition list at all because the men who used it made sure no written record survived. That story is considerably darker than anything on this list.